host a statewide event on violence and what's been going on in the community. And they'd like to bring people in, and we'll have conversations. They're hoping we can help them find some speakers as well. Every year we do a prayer breakfast every January at our office. And this prayer breakfast, I would call it somewhat unique, where all we do is we have prayers from about 6 or 7 different individuals from different religious denominations. A prayer, we would say, listen, we'd like for you to pray for our country. We'd like for you to pray for this. We would like for you to pray for this. And we'll have multiple denominations have prayer, and then we have breakfast. And many of the people who come will tell us that we never go places where we're not just sitting around people of our same faith. And so you could come to our breakfast and see someone who is a Catholic, someone who's an Adventist, someone who's a rabbi, someone who's leader in the Methodist Church, and we're talking more about the things that we have in common as opposed to the things that cause us to be viewing that we are different. This is an effort to let people know who we are. You know, we had an interesting story. Our county executive came to have lunch with us. So every now and then we'll do protocol lunches where we'll have our political leaders come in to see us and tell us, you know, what can we do to be helpful? What can we do in this community? Because sometimes you may think you know, but you really don't know. We're blessed where we are to have our office in Howard County, Maryland, which is one of the richest counties in the United States. It's clearly the richest county in Maryland and maybe the second richest county in the United States. But the middle school that's closest to us has a large number of homeless children that are there, and which was something that we could have never thought of. And one of the things under the leadership of Melissa, we ended up going to the school to help to pay for school lunches of public school students. Because what many of us don't realize is when you're in a public school in many instances and you can no longer pay for your school lunch, they will still provide you lunch, but they will provide you the least nutritional lunch possible or the cheapest lunch possible. But when you can have that bill paid, it actually will allow you now to be eating the best food that's there. And what is interesting is now Howard County now has actually changed its rules that even if you don't have your bill paid up, you still can get the best lunch possible. So I think part of the idea is when you go out and make an impact and you go out and make a statement, sometimes it can change things. People in the office will tell you that I have a real issue with one of the driving patterns when you get off of the parkway to get to our building. To get to our building, you have to jump off like this highway and jump all the way over to the other side of the road to make a left-hand turn so you could go in. People hear me complain about it in the office all the time. We had our county executive come and have lunch with us one day, and when we were upstairs having lunch, he looked at me, he said, you know, it looks like a pretty dangerous turn out there. And I was able to say, and thank God you can do something about it. And now as part of the future plans on the traffic patterns, they're going to make changes to make it easier for not have to worry about making that dangerous turn. But I would say that having our county executive come to visit us and having lunch available and having conversations, that you end up learning things that you would not really understand. I'll tell you one other thing that's real surprising. I mentioned we're in the second richest county maybe in the United States. And when we asked our county executive, what are one of the issues you think we could help you with? And you know what he said? Financial literacy. And I was like, huh? He says, I have a county with people who make a ton of money and not all of them know how they should be investing. So now we're not necessarily growing maybe from an investment standpoint the way we should. And with some of the expertise that we know that you have with your education system and other things that you do, then it would be helpful. Maybe you could help us put together some things. So we talked with our treasurer at the time, Randy, who gave us some information that we could send off to the county executive's office. They in turn use it to kind of filter it into some activities going on at different events, something I would have never thought about. But it's so important that you scratch where the itch is as opposed to simply going out and doing what you think makes sense in the community. You know, when you find out who they say that you are, your ministry changes. Because when you show up and it's only who you think they say that you are, then when you find out who they do say that you are, things have to change. But you can't find that out unless you go out and get in the community. You know, sometimes we've always been worrying about that we're supposed to be a church that's not supposed to be in the world, and we're not supposed to be in the world. But we do have to be of the world to some degree in order to make an impact. There are people who need to hear from us. There are people who need to feel us. There are people who need to know that we are Christians by our love. I love to tell people salt in a salt shaker cannot impact the food. You could have a table full of salt shakers, but you can't be the salt of the earth if you're unwilling to get involved. You can't be the light of the world if it's under a bushel. And the public affairs side of what we do gives us an opportunity to let them know who we are, and then maybe they may be interested in what we believe. And so that's an area that we try to focus on. The team focuses in a lot of different areas. I'm probably the person who does a lot more work in the area of dealing with kind of like the local politicians, trying to figure out where we need to be. I think I told you guys during the service today, I practiced law for 25 years before I started working for the church. And even our sermon today was talking about how God has taken you through things that are really preparation for other things. And I've been blessed that a lot of the things I've been taught in previous life has been helpful in my current life. And so I'll just end with the idea that we talked today in our sermon about making sure that when we experience the miracles of God, that you never lose out on the moments that you need to be doing something. And I am saying that the work that we do, I really see in a standpoint that we can have a miracle where we end up in places we're not supposed to be, but then our moment requires us to do something to draw somebody else closer to Christ. And hopefully that's what we're doing in our public affairs side. So I will just end with that. So thank you very much.
So yesterday, some of us had the privilege of touring the Capitol. And I've been to the Capitol several times. It was the first time for the others. I said, I've been to a few state capitals. Salem is my state capital, in Oregon. And I said, the one in Boise really is like beautiful. We gotta go see it. So we went in. We had the great tour, and we go by down in the bottom hallway. There's a door that says legislative advisors or legislative advocate, and the tour guide says, actually, that's really a nice way to say lobbyists. We're legislative advocates. I monitor what goes on in our state legislatures during session. What things we want to promote, what things we want to not promote, or even kill a bill. But we also do this on the federal level, and that is done through Melissa Reed, who is our Associate Director for Public Affairs and Religious Liberty at the North American Division. She will talk to us about legislative advocacy. Will you please welcome Melissa Reed?
Thank you, and good afternoon. What Andre didn't share, for those of you that haven't taken the tour of the Capitol, is that room is actually a bank vault. You didn't mention that right then, did you? No, yeah. So they can lock the lobbyist in, so they actually don't have access. And also, lobbyists feel most comfortable when they're near money, I think, unless they are lobbying for the Seventh-day Adventist Church, and then that's a completely different sort of thing. But anyway, it's very good to be with you this afternoon. It's a real treat to be able to present with my colleagues. Like Andre was saying, typically we on Sabbaths are off on our own doing sort of things, but it really is nice for you all to be able to see, as Orlin was saying, the breadth of the things that our ministry, the areas in which we serve, and also how it works together in partnership, right? But my primary responsibility, as Andre said, is to advocate for the Seventh-day Adventist Church and its members, so organizational as well as individual religious freedom rights. And so the way that I do that is paying attention to the legislation, federal legislation, and my focus at the North American Division is on domestic legislation, so domestic religious liberty policy. And as Andre said, sometimes that means that I'm advocating for a particular piece of legislation on behalf of the church. Other times I am opposing it, sharing our concerns about a particular piece of legislation, and very often I'm only talking about a small component of a piece of legislation. That's happened recently where, for example, the Respect for Marriage Act was being passed, and the Seventh-day Adventist Church has not taken a position on same-sex marriage, but what we are very adamant about is that there is always, to be clear, let me rephrase that. We have not taken a position on the legality of same-sex marriage. I'll be very clear there. But what we have taken a position on is that making sure that people of faith who hold to a traditional biblical understanding of marriage have the freedom and the respect and are not discriminated against because of that belief. And so there was a component, I worked with representatives from other faith traditions down on Capitol Hill to make sure that that was very clear when that piece of legislation was passed, the Respect for Marriage Act. So as I mentioned, it's a real privilege to be able to work with my colleagues here in the Seventh-day Adventist Church. It also is a real privilege to be able to step outside of the Seventh-day Adventist Church and partner with other individuals who view religious freedom in the same way that we do, right? And again, maybe we're certainly not landing on the same place as far as all of our doctrines. Sometimes we're, worshiping on different days of the week. Sometimes we are worshiping different deities, particularly in the international side of things. But what we are coming together and recognizing is that it's so important that we have the privilege and ability to be able to practice and share our faith with other individuals. And so it's really neat, particularly in this political environment and even in the social environment, to be able to both find and recognize and respect the differences that we have as people, as individuals. So I just kind of referenced sort of the political moment that we are in. And where it's tough right now to be a Seventh-day Adventist as far as when you're advocating for things, because our perspective is that, and as Bettina will mention earlier, she'll talk about the legacy of the church's understanding of religious freedom and the separation of church and state. That is not even within faith traditions that are advocating on Capitol Hill, it's not the way that religious freedom is viewed by most Christians here in the United States these days. Their understanding of religious freedom is more of a religious freedom for them to be able to practice their own faith, and not for other faith traditions, right? And actually making use of the government to be able to facilitate that practice, right? And to incorporate their faith into the secular government. And so it's, that said, it's a minority understanding, but God is mighty, amen? And so just in the time that I've been able to work in this field, we've had some really positive experiences where we have made substantive change, whether it's protecting something or expanding rights. It's been really incredible to see the way that God can work, and encouraging as well. That said, there is certainly that level of dysfunction that's happening in the federal government right now. And so really this year, my focus has been working on the state level and state level advocacy. We are seeing in states that have either a very Republican-dominated state legislature or a very Democratic-dominated legislature. That's where things are happening, right? In DC right now, there's gridlock, and so it's just a lot of name calling and backbiting and running for election also, a re-election, as the case may be. And so this past year, or since the beginning of the year, I've actually worked in 2 different states, in Minnesota and also in Maryland, where I live, on very similar pieces of legislation that are working their way through the state legislature, and it was dealing with the rights of religious employers. So Orland mentioned that we're in Howard County, Maryland. Not only is the North American Division headquartered in Maryland, but also the World Church, the General Conference. Our union, the Columbia Union is also in Maryland, and on at least one or maybe two other conferences as well, plus our insurance company, ADRA is there, lots of religious employers just for the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And so in both of these situations, in both states, something that has always been, we haven't had challenges with, I guess, previously, is respecting the right of the religious employer to be able to determine, or to the religious employer to be able to discriminate in its employment practices. And what I mean by that is in particular areas. And one of those is in religious areas. Like we have the right as a Seventh-day Adventist, the Seventh-day Adventist Church has the right as an employer to only hire Seventh-day Adventists, right? To me, that makes a lot of sense. That makes perfect sense. And also, you know, not just hire individuals who are Seventh-day Adventists, but who espouse lifestyle and all of the practices that go along, the accoutrement that go along with being a Seventh-day Adventist. And so in these two states, which are very liberal states, or blue, what we refer to as blue states, which is different than blue laws, by the way. And so what we have seen is that these states were actually putting forth the idea that no religious employers should not have those rights to be able to discriminate in their hiring, which would really impact not just the Seventh-day Adventist Church, but all faith-based organizations that are in either of those states, right? And so, again, we worked in both states with partners from other faith traditions to really explain why it's so essential to our being able to fulfill our mission, a mission that serves the broader community, right? That serves the state where the offices are, or the organizations abide. And so we met with lawmakers, we had conversation, we reached out to all of the various offices. We met with our faith partners, and there was even some media. I wasn't particularly involved in the media aspects, but there was, at least in Minnesota, a widespread media campaign as well, and let it be known, again, what our perspective was and why this was so valuable and important to us. And thankfully, so both of those states have sessions, and I think this is true of Idaho too. It's just the first 3 months of the year. The legislative session is already over. And both of those bills did not go outside of the committee that they were introduced in. They were killed. They were defeated. And so we were very happy, pleased for that to happen. But that said, it's something, and if you're paying attention to legislation at all, bills never really pass the first time that they're introduced, right? Or substantive bills don't. And so we know that this is something that we're going to need to be paying attention to, that there's going to continue to be that push to make that happen, to move in that direction as far as the society. So that's just one area that we've been working. But as I said, it really is a privilege to be able to do the work that I do, to work with the individuals that I work with, and most of all, to be able to serve the church on behalf of you all, the church and its members. One of the things, the example that I've just given you there is for the rights of the religious organization, the religious freedom rights of the organization. But the church is also very dedicated to the religious freedom rights of the individual. And I think Todd will talk a little bit more about that in the judicial work that he does. But I'll turn it over there, and thank you for your kind attention.
One thing Melissa mentioned, that a lot of the work that our parole directors and advocates do is really quiet work. It's done behind the scenes. It's done in legislative committees, or in the back offices of our of our county commissions and city councils. And and when things come up, it isn't done in before the lights of the cameras or up front. It's really done through phone calls and relationships that we have with our local elected representatives. And so, evangelists are out up front. We do our evangelism kind of, in the on the side and in the quietness. I serve as both General Counsel and Parole Director for the North Pacific Union, but did you know that the church actually has a law firm in it? The General Conference Office of General Counsel, based in Silver Spring, Maryland, represents the legal interests of the church, one of them being religious liberty. Todd McFarland you can consider him as the chief litigation officer of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. So it's really really great that he's here to give us a firsthand perspective of what the church does as far as litigation advocacy does for our church members and for others in faith. So will you please welcome Todd McFarland.
Thanks, Andre. Yes, I'm the one that gets to sue people, but sometimes people just need suing, and that's what we're here for. But it's actually a lot more than that. A lot of what we try to do is prevention work, right? And my work is divided in two halves, representing the institutional work and the individual. And I want to talk briefly about both of those. First, let me talk about the individual work. Now, for some of you who were here this morning, talked about Groff versus DeJoy. Those are what we call our Title VII, our Sabbath accommodation cases. That's sort of the nuts and bolts, the meat and potatoes, so to speak, of the representation we do of individual members, because that is where most of the conflicts in the workplace have historically come up. And the Adventist Church's advocacy there has been longstanding, well-recognized, and has led, along with some of our partners, to some very favorable law and change in the law that we can now build on and continue to work on as Seventh-day Adventists. But it's not just Sabbath accommodation cases and so on that we help church members on. Evangelistic, literature evangelist work, right? So in different parts of the country, we have summer student literature evangelists that go door to door. And that work sometimes can be subject to municipal ordinances, almost all of which are unconstitutional. We work with them when we have kids arrested, which we did just a couple of weeks ago and out east in the United States. We provide them counsel and represent them. In other situations where church members, we've had housing cases. In the military, we've had situations in the military where military personnel have had problems, and we provide, again, with our partners, help in all of those. We also work on the institutional side. So, for instance, a couple of years ago, and again, a different part of the country, a local church wanted to have a Revelation seminar. Now, they decided, and this was their choice, they kind of went old school, and so they had a flyer that they put up that was something that was more common, let's just say, in the 1980s, right? It had a picture there of the lady from Babylon, as we may sometimes call it, had a wine glass in it and had some animals and so forth, and sort of invoked end-time events and so forth and other issues of the day. Well, they had rented out the local high school to have these meetings in for a number of reasons. They didn't think they'd have room at the church, and oftentimes having it a neutral site is helpful. So they'd rented that out, had the paperwork, paid the thing. The high school there rented out to churches all the time. There was no problem with that. The problem was it showed up in the principal's mailbox, right? Just she lived in the community. And I'm not sure if she just wasn't a fan of Adventists, though the flyer didn't really say Seventh-day Adventist on it, or probably more likely she just saw this, different stuff on there, and she was not impressed and was basically said, not in my school. And so it kicked them out. Even though they had an agreement, told them, nope, you can't go, we'll refund your money to you. Of course, the problem is, first of all, they had all the flyers out, right? So that's where people were expecting to go. They had an evangelist coming in. And also, more importantly, you can't rent to the Baptist on Sunday, which they did, and other organizations, and just tell us, well, you can't come in because a principal looked at the flyer and just didn't like it. Like, this is America. You don't get to do that. And so we reached out to the county or to the school district and everything. And we're like, listen, went up and down the chain, couldn't do it. I'm like, all right. So they contacted our office. And so, there's a provision which you can go get a court order. You can ask a judge to rule on this. And so we were working on that, and we had about 2 weeks, which in legal world is just virtually no time. That is a very limited amount of time. And so the way this stuff works is when you file it on an emergency basis, the court expects you to work with the attorneys for the other organization. So like, normal case, you've seen sort of on TV, like, you come and serve a person with a lawsuit, right? You've seen that, you've been served. Normally then you have 20 or 30 or 60 days to respond. But on these emergency issues, they really expect you to line up the other side's lawyers or find them. So the Wednesday before, I called up found just by internet research, who I thought were the county's attorneys, called them up. Hey, do you represent this school district? Yeah, we do. I'm like, all right. I'm like, well, we're filing our preliminary injunction over the flyer program on Friday. This was Wednesday, so I just want to make contact and everything because, the judge is going to ask me about that and everything, and just, let me know who the attorney is going to be representing the school district, because the judge is going to want to, have to hear on this soon. And they're like, what are you talking about? I'm like, the rental for our evangelistic series that your client refused us on. I'm like, I'm assuming they ran that by you. It turns out they hadn't. And make a long story short, half hour before we were going to file the preliminary injunction on Friday afternoon at 11:30, they completely caved. We had the evangelistic series, and in fact, they had some baptisms from that. So that, I think, is an example of where being part of a larger church really it benefits, because that local congregation, even though they were absolutely right, would have had a very hard time navigating that. And unfortunately, that school district, I guess they teach their kids, but they missed the First Amendment portion of that discussion. So we had to give them an education, and hopefully they learned that. The last thing I want to talk about real quickly here is we also do something called amicus work, or amicus curiae, which is Latin for friend of the court. And that's where there'll be cases, usually at the Supreme Court, but not always, that have wide impact on the church, but we're not a party to. So for instance, the perfect example of that was this case, Groff versus DeJoy. However that case came out was going to impact Seventh-day Adventists and others, but yet we were not sitting at the table. We were not a party. Now I want to be very clear. The attorneys who were there, one of whom was a Seventh-day Adventist, Alan Reinach, and the partners and so forth that came on were working with this. This is very much in collaboration. But there'll be other cases that we file on, right? So for instance, one of the more recent ones was there was a Rastafarian down in Louisiana, had dreadlocks on. Whether you agree about that religion or not, and whether you agree or not about this, the reality is in Louisiana, if you're a prisoner there, you have the right to have your dreadlocks. And that's based on laws that the Adventist Church helped advocate for, and the Court of Appeals, the highest court in that territory, had made that very clear. Said you have the right to have your dreadlocks. The guy was in prison on a very short, I think it was like only 3 years. He only had a few months left in his prison sentence. He gets transferred to another prison. He has his dreadlocks. They take him in the intake and they're like, oh no, you can't have those. He, believe it or not, had a copy of the opinion that said Louisiana can't force them to cut off his dreadlocks, or people like him. The guard was wholly unimpressed with it. In the words of the Fifth Circuit, unpersuaded by our opinion, the guard threw it in the trash. And so just put it in the trash. They took him to a back room, held him down, and shaved his dreadlocks, like literally weeks before he was supposed to be released. And so the question that was going up to the Supreme Court is not whether or not that was constitutional or right. The answer is it absolutely is not. But what's a right if you can't enforce it, right? Nothing. And the question was whether or not that guard and whether the correctional department can be held liable and he can get damages for that, because the state isn't going to follow a rule unless they, have some skin in the game. So that is kind of the stuff we do. I will say just, some of the other stuff, and there may be questions on this. People have asked about like, well, where's the church's stance on, so for instance, Louisiana now has a 10 Commandments law that required those to be posted in all public schools. That's being challenged. Where's the court stance on that? Oklahoma has a law now in which they have a public a charter school that is religious, and that's being challenged. Where's the church's stance on that? And the answer to those is, wherein the church often expresses its opinion is through its amicus committee, and there's various people on that committee. I am privileged to be the secretary of it, and so we on the legal not legislative, sorry, long afternoon. On the legal advocacy side, balance the church's view. So we're not setting the church's view. We're taking the church's view and its longstanding belief in religious liberty, but putting that in context for the modern society, and then also, updating it in the context of the case that has come forward. So, and then the last thing I'll just talk about, I get to support Melissa and others on legislation. So we talked about the Respect for Marriage Act. A lot of, well, what is the language we do want, right? And that comes through our office. So Melissa's job is to get the wording passed. My job is to help make sure the wording is the right wording that we get passed. But I will let her work on Capitol Hill, a place of many places of intrigue. So with that, Andre, I will turn it over next to Bettina and the great work that Liberty Magazine does. Thank you.
So we're all familiar with Liberty Magazine? Yes. As I go to legislative offices in our state capitals, I will often see, when you go into the legislators, either their office or their cubby even, on the desk or on the entryway, they'll have magazines, and I will often see Liberty Magazine there in legislative offices in our state capitals. That is how important this outreach is. Bettina is a champion's champion. She is a lawyer, but she also has served as Associate Director of Religious Liberty at the General Conference, now serving as Editor-in-Chief of Liberty Magazine. So to talk to us about the literary advocacy that we do, please welcome Bettina Krause.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Andre. I know that I've been placed here at the end of the lineup to clear up the heresies of my colleagues. And I want to just say, I have worked with Todd since, I think, when you came on. Was it about 10 years ago? Oh, no, I came in 06. 06, okay. Well, longer than what I thought. But let me tell you, I am glad he's on our side, because I would hate to be facing him across a courtroom. So how many have heard of Liberty Magazine? How many subscribe? Oh, I'm shocked, I'm horrified. I was going to ask how many people read it from cover to cover, but I don't know that there will be anyone in the room, except my colleagues, I hope. So Liberty Magazine is a publication to be proud of. It was published first in 1906. And it is today the oldest or longest running continuously published magazine of its type in the whole world. It's our magazine, and it expresses our views on religious freedom. And today it is still reaching into the offices of judges, into the offices of lawmakers, federal and state level, into the offices of county officials, city officials, and leaders of other faith groups. And it's bringing that unique perspective on religious liberty. It's bringing a distinct Adventist voice into issues of culture and politics and law. Now, when it was first published, there was a lot going on in America. And, Melissa very discreetly said that, we're enduring a political moment in time. Well, there was a moment in time back in 1906 when all of the states of America, except for 3 states, had Sunday-level blue laws on the books. One of those states, you'll be pleased to know, was Idaho, that did not have Sunday laws on the books. And you've obviously been a freedom-loving state for a very long time. But that is a context in which Liberty Magazine arose, fighting for the rights, not just for ourselves, but of every person of faith or no faith at all. But something strange has happened when we talk about religious liberty these days. Something odd is going on, because when we talk about religious liberty today, it is divisive, it's controversial. And if you don't believe me, Just trust me, I'm the editor of Liberty magazines. I've got the emails to prove it. I get those emails. Melissa, Todd, and Orland, they've been talking about specific issues that we deal with as a church on a weekly and monthly basis in religious liberty. But I want to spend just a few moments stepping back a moment and talking about something bigger that's going on in American society and something that really defines the challenge of Liberty magazine today. And that is the fact that religious liberty is no longer a unifying idea or ideal in American society. Let me ask you this. When you come across a news story that references religious liberty, do you think that this is going to paint a glowing portrait of Christianity? Yeah, it does. It depends on the outlet. But more often than not these days, it doesn't. Religious liberty has a PR problem. Here's another question. Is religious liberty as a public policy issue, is it a Democratic issue or is it a Republican issue? Yeah, that's a diplomatic answer, but I think we know where it sits in the pantheon of political issues these days. 25 years ago, I came to this country fresh out of law school. My first job was with an organization called Council on Religious Freedom down in Washington, D.C. And when I attended coalition meetings in support of legislation, sitting around the table with me were people who spanned the political spectrum from right to left. There were the religious types, there were the conservative types, there were also members of the ACLU, members of Americans United for Separation of Church and State, and we all sat there together because we believed that religious free exercise was a fundamental human right that deserved protection. Melissa again diplomatically said that there's dysfunction in Washington. Understatement. Can you imagine something like that happening today? It's not possible. Religious freedom has become a divisive issue. Listen to what the chairman of the US Civil Rights Commission said about religious liberty just a few years back. He said this: "Religious liberty will stand for nothing except hypocrisy, so long as it remains code for discrimination, intolerance, racism, sexism, homophobia, Islamophobia, Christian supremacy, or any form of intolerance." That's quite a statement. But is it true? Because if it's true, we're in trouble. Because we have said with very good reason for many years that religious liberty is in the DNA of our church. It's in our history, it's in our theology, it's in our current advocacy efforts. It's even embedded in our structure. Think about it. We've got something like 900 headquarters around the world, divisions, unions, conferences. Each one of those has a public affairs and religious liberty department. We have something like 160,000 congregations around the world where there is a layperson who is usually serving as a religious liberty director. Religious liberty is embedded in who we are, in our identity. But when it's defined like that, I'm not sure I want that. So whose definition of religious freedom are we talking about? When you take religious liberty outside of the culture war issues of America, it is not hard to understand. As Andre mentioned, I worked in the area of international religious liberty for many, many years. And one of the cases that we dealt with was of a young Seventh-day Adventist church member in Pakistan. And he was just 27 years old when he was arrested for a crime of blasphemy. He was falsely accused, as it turns out, of sending a text message, a blasphemous text message about the Prophet of Islam. And so he was serving a life sentence in Pakistan. And if you have ever wondered what conditions are like in a maximum security jail in Pakistan, just look it up, because it's overcrowded, there is vermin, there is lack of access to medical care, there's lack of adequate food. And this young man was enduring these conditions. And even at that time, the religious hardliners of Pakistan were trying to get his life sentence converted into a death penalty. There is nothing difficult to understand about religious freedom when it's taken out of the polarized extremes of America today. But America today is fighting with two extremes. On one hand, you have those who say religious freedom is overprotected. It is being used as a tool of Christians and conservatives to enforce their own bigotry. Then on the other end of the spectrum, you have those who seem to see the constitutional protections of religious freedom as a tool to claw back power for majority American Christianity, to, in the words of a t-shirt I saw recently, to make America Christian again. And we are people of prophecy. We understand that that is a very dangerous path to start walking down. So these are the two extremes that we are trapped between, and this is the environment that Liberty Magazine is speaking into. 25 years ago, we were talking about school prayer, we were talking about religious displays on government property. These were the hot button topics that we were discussing in Liberty Magazine. Today, we're talking about parental rights, whether parents have the right to be told if their child is transitioning their gender at school. We're running articles on whether teachers have the legal right to withhold information and to encourage students to transition. The issues have changed, the times have changed, but the message of Liberty Magazine has not changed, and it is still very, very relevant today. Because it is a message that says every human being is created by God, every human being has the stamp of the divine, and every human being is worthy of respect, worthy of dignity, worthy of the choice to decide who they will worship and how they will worship. And we stand for that right for ourselves, but also for other people. So thank you for supporting Liberty Magazine. Thank you for helping us not only defend the rights of people of faith, but also to defend the character of the God that we serve.
Thank you, Bettina. We're going to have our panel discussion, and before we get started, I would like to invite Amira Al-Haddad to join the panel. Now, Amira actually has already had a full day. She has preached 2 services at Nampa, and so, but you know the Energizer battery commercials with the Energizer Bunny. Amira is our Energizer Bunny. Yes, no, and she serves as the Public Affairs and Religious Liberty Director for the Southern Union, based in Atlanta, and so she also brings a wealth of experience and knowledge in the area. So it's great to have Amira with us. Please welcome Amira Al-Haddad. Let's see. I'm sorry. So we have microphones, and I'm going to have a roving mic. And actually, Amira, I'm gonna start the first question for you, and then take it to the others. Is Bettina mentioned that 160,000 congregations worldwide, but what does plural advocacy mean to the church member in the pew, and what we do as local plural directors? What is your view on that?
My job as the local union plural director in the Southern Union, hi y'all, is to serve the people that I represent in my territory. I am their servant. I'm not just their leader, but I am there to protect and defend religious liberty for them on an individual basis. I am there to protect and defend the mission of the church and the communities that I live and serve and work in. And I am there to enable my church members to also go out and protect religious liberty in their communities. So it's a partnership, not just me doing the work, but my members doing the work with me as we kind of tag team on the things that we need to do. The case that Todd talked about on the evangelism case that we had, that was in my territory. And while that case sounds kind of exciting and he gave you the big picture, I had another picture that I had to deal with. And that picture was that I had a church member who worked at that school. And she was terrified of losing her job if we sued her school district. She was terrified of the relationship breakdown that may occur if we proceeded to sue her employer. And so those are real issues that we had to deal with. And by the way, the seminar Todd was talking about, I preached in that church in January. They had one convert from that seminar. And she came up to me and she gave me a big hug. She says, "You don't know who I am, but I'm here today because of religious liberty." And so I was like, yay. It's kind of like the MasterCard commercial, you know, the tickets to the game, $700, you know, your hat for your team, $34, you know, the experience with your son, priceless. So for us, it was like the cost of the brief to file, and you know.
Amir says that because she didn't have to pay the cost of the
Right,
brief.
I didn't have to pay the cost of the brief. But again, when we're talking about the cost of the brief, that's because you, our church members that are out there, you're giving your tithes and offerings to the church so that we can use those offerings in the Religious Liberty Department to defend things we need to defend. And that's very important. Your offering during the Religious Liberty time isn't just for Liberty Magazine. It's for many things that we do in the department. And so I'm just happy that for me, I can serve my church members, and there's almost 300,000 in my territory. So my batteries are starting to run down a little bit sometimes. But we plug in at night and wake up refreshed in the morning.
Melissa.
Yeah, so like Orlin, I've also had the privilege of serving at my local church as the religious liberty leader. And it just, first of all, one of the things that we didn't mention as far as NAD and also at the union level is one of our responsibilities is providing resources, equipping our local religious liberty leaders and members, right? We're all in this together. We're all advocating together. You know, as I mentioned, we're a minority faith tradition, so it's all hands on deck with this, right? And so we, Orlin, I don't know if you had a chance, if you mentioned some of our resources during Divine Worship, but we, of course, have Liberty Magazine, a flagship journal. If you haven't read it recently, please take a look. It is incredible, like top-notch authors and dealing with the issues that you're seeing in the headlines. And so we have that resource. We also have Bettina and Alan Reinick, who is the Religious Liberty Director for the Pacific Union, also have a podcast that's available on its YouTube channel, which Bettina can share with you. And then we have a television show, Faith and Politics. When Orlin stood up to preach today, you guys were like, I know that guy from somewhere, right? You know him from TV. He's the host of Faith and Politics, which is on the Hope channel. It also has its own YouTube channel, and it's on Roku streaming as well. And that is a panel discussion, a half-hour panel discussion, where we talk about contemporary issues. And so all of those things we are creating to share, to communicate the diversity and the breadth of religious liberty, both international and domestic, that are happening. And so when I was serving as the religious liberty leader at my local church, I could make use of all of those resources, both to educate myself and to be able to share with others, both within the church and externally. So, it's that two-part role of educating your church. We talked about the individuals that are joining the church, and very often those are the individuals who then have Sabbath accommodation, workplace accommodation issues. So it's your job to make sure that the individual, if that is the unfortunate situation that they're experiencing, know that the church is here to be able to assist with getting that accommodation by their employer. And we also, on the local church level, are building relationships in the same way that Orland talked about as far as the public affairs. So when I was serving in my community at my local church, I made sure, first of all, that all of our state representatives and county representatives for my districts were receiving Liberty Magazine. And not only were they receiving Liberty Magazine, they knew why they were receiving it, who it was, why it was just randomly showing up in their mailbox. And then when we had our religious liberty emphasis times, we invited individuals to come, those government representatives to come and participate in our programming, to again communicate to them how much we appreciate the religious freedom that we have under the United States government, and we appreciated their role in preserving that. And so, and then again, another thing that we often do is on the local level, it's a way to get to know other faith leaders in your community, and explaining to them why, when you have a right, a lot of times, if it's something that you've always experienced, you don't realize the privilege that it is, much like, we've never experienced here in the United States what the gentleman in Pakistan, the believer in Pakistan, has experienced. Praise God that we haven't. And so, unfortunately, sometimes we don't recognize how very precious those rights are. And so, having conversations with other faith leaders and explaining to them and sharing with them sort of the fragility of these rights and how we can work together as believers to defend and protect those rights is another way that we on the local level can do that as well.
Yeah. Bettina, you have, Orland, you have something to add? So as a union parle leader, how it works really is, as I will often get a call from a local parle director or leader at a church, or a conference level, and say, we have an issue in a local community, Idaho Falls, let's say. And really, the way we first troubleshoot it is, okay, who do I know in that community that's perhaps an elected official on the county commission or the city council or local school board, whoever. And we'll talk and we'll say, okay, maybe we don't know anybody elected. Maybe the pastor does. We'll bring in the local pastor and he'll say, you know what, I don't know any electeds, but a member of my congregation is a member of the Chamber of Commerce. And we'll connect with that person. And the person who's a member of the Chamber of Commerce says, yes, actually, Counselor so-and-so.
Religious freedom is protected in the United States. And, not to get too into the weeds on it, but up until a case called Kennedy versus Bremerton, just a couple of years back, the praying football coach, do you remember this guy?
Yes.
Yep, okay. Up until then, at least on the books, there was a case which controlled how the courts interpreted Establishment Clause issues. And it was an approach which allowed the courts to say, no, this goes too far into the area of breaking down that wall of separation between church and state. Well, in Kennedy versus Bremerton, that test was swept away. And in its place, there's a new way of approaching Establishment Clause issues, which really has been an invitation to those in the states who want to push the Establishment Clause restraints as far as possible and see how far they can push it before it will break. And so that is why, Andre, we are seeing a more recent rash in these legislative initiatives at the state level, which are attacking, our this constitutional principle of separation of church and state.
Orland.
Yeah, I think that's part of the issue in terms of the idea, as we were talking about, that you think you have a friendly court that may be at the end, that if you can try to get as much in the pipeline as possible on the front end, hoping that you'll get to that end decision that you're looking for, is where we see a lot of the activities happening. One of the things that's been kind of interesting is, this concept of stare decisis in the law, which generally used to mean that you could have rules, you could have regulations, but unless you had a specific case in which you needed to go to court with it, you really didn't end up kind of like dealing with the issue. Well, now we're seeing the courts really starting to take on matters, and you may not even have a specific case to take it on. So it becomes almost a policy battle that takes place where you don't even have a specific set of facts that you're kind of going with in order to come to a decision, which sometimes causes the court to be accused of being more of an activist operation as opposed to one that's kind of just ruling on what comes before it. And so I think all of that has caused a lot of the confusions that we see. And then the reality is from an Adventist perspective, we are not a monolithic group of thinkers as it relates to politics and in a lot of different things. So this whole idea that, for example, I could make a statement regarding what we believe as a church that 100% will fall in line with that statement is just incorrect. As a matter of fact, I usually tell people that no matter what we say, half the church is going to be mad. And that's just kind of the reality, because we are in so different spectrums of what we believe. And I don't necessarily think that that's a bad thing. I think the idea that you have different points of view in a religious group is a healthy part of what's going on. Should there be some bedrocks and standards and foundational beliefs that we should always have? Absolutely. But the idea that you may have some nuanced thinking that may be a little bit different is not the end of the world from my perspective. And the statement that I make a lot, that if I polled everybody in this room and asked you exactly how you keep the Sabbath, I might find 100 different answers that would come back. And it doesn't mean that we are any less Seventh-day Adventists. It just means that there are sometimes different points of view that you have decided based on your personal relationship with your Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. Well, we were talking yesterday among ourselves, and I was telling people, when I was growing up as a child, the only people who really ever worked on the Sabbath were people that worked in the medical profession. If you were a doctor, you were a nurse, you were taking care of somebody, they worked on the Sabbath. Well, today, I know police officers who believe that they're engaging in service to their community, that they believe it's okay to work on the Sabbath. And then there are other people who have different points of view that I may not share, but I don't necessarily look at it as being, quote unquote, anti-Adventist or something that's wrong from their perspective. And I think that's where we have to really find a balance as to how we look at things in order to understand that we can be unified without being uniform. And I think that's the nuance and the balance that we're trying to figure out how to find.
I just wanted to take it back to the local church for a second and point out, so we're talking about the judicial and we were talking about the Supreme Court specifically there. It is, we have not done our job effectively if it gets to Todd's desk, as far as, do you know what I mean? Like as local church, right? When the individual, first of all, because for one reason, we know Todd's going to take care of it. And so, it's not going to go beyond Todd, right? But how much time and energy and money has been spent on whatever the issue is before it ever reaches the Supreme Court? And so the conversations about church members being aware of their own religious freedom rights or the religious freedom rights of their community members, right, their friends and family. And for the pastor to be able to, is always the first line of defense for Sabbath accommodation. Well, if that doesn't work out, then we move to the union, right? And if that doesn't work out, then we move to the conference. At the same time, when we're talking about legislation or rights, that is a congressional responsibility, right? We shouldn't be, and we see, when it does go to the judicial system, not only is there the time and the expense, but then you see these very narrow or as Bettina was just describing, sort of maybe nebulous that then allow for a potential negative expansion happen. And so we are all working together from the local church member to the conference, to the union, to the division, and then to Todd McFarland.
Floor for any questions you have for our all-star panel. All right, we'll come over here and yeah, be sure to get my attention, and I'll go in the order in which I see you.
All right, this is a loaded question. The theme song for the Olympics is Imagine. Imagine no religion. And it seems like the whole world has bought that concept. So from your experience, how much better off is the world without religion?
Well, I don't think the world is better off without religion, but I also think that the world is better off with the understanding that there are multiple ways in our country that people do celebrate their religion. And one of the things that I will say about the Adventist church that sometimes we don't talk enough about is we don't simply just fight for Seventh-day Adventists. We fight for everyone, because we take on the adage that we need to ensure that there's freedom for all. And in particular, that is more important when you are one of the smaller religions in a particular area. When you hang around among Adventists, you kind of have this thought that we're this kind of big behemoth organization in the United States. And, and I always kind of grab a line that Todd always uses, is that we punch above our weight class because of all the institutions that we have. When people think about our healthcare institutions, which is probably second largest behind the Catholics, or our academic institutions, which is second largest probably behind the Catholics as well. But the reality is, in the United States, there's probably about 1 million Adventists. But in the United States, there's probably about 8 million Mormons. There's probably around 7 million Methodists. There are probably around 8 million Lutheran. There's probably 30 million Southern Baptists. There's probably 90 million Catholic. And our number is what? 1 million Americans that are Seventh-day Adventists. So if you believe that you can fight a religious fight and you want to fight it in your own concentric circle on your own, you will find out that you will be in a very, very tough situation very quickly. So the idea is not to be able to go out and say, well, we want to promote other religions. The idea is to go out and say that all religions should be treated fairly and their beliefs should be treated fairly, because we probably will benefit more from that type of dialogue than some of the bigger ones that would simply say, well, let's all just raise our hands and vote, because I can assure you if everybody raises their hand and vote, Friday night sundown to Sabbath sundown probably is not going to win. And so that's why it's so important that, and some people are very uncomfortable with the fact that why should we fight the fight for other religious groups? Well, it's because that is a dialogue that actually is beneficial to us as well.
Just real quickly, and I'm going to take you guys' questions. I think a lot of this can be explained, the difference between, say, the American Revolution and the French Revolution. The French Revolution, the Catholic Church, or the dominant church at the time, was very much on the side of the monarchy. It stood in the way of the freedoms and liberty, and it needed to be knocked down, quite frankly, along with the monarchy, because it was, one on one. In the American Revolution, you didn't see that, right? The religious institutions, it was more pluralistic, and they were not defending the crown. And I think that's why what the current environment is so dangerous, is if people view, I've got to get religion before I can have my sexual orientation or even my gender identity or racial equality or pick or whatever it is, then they're not just going to move for that, they're going to try to destroy that institution as well. Now, that does not mean that we as religious institutions change our beliefs. But what it does mean is we have to think about where is the line between us having the religious freedom and imposing our religious beliefs, say, for instance, the meaning of the definition of marriage on other people. And as Melissa corrected herself, I about came out of the seat when you said the church didn't have a stance on same-sex marriage. We do have one, but what Melissa was referring to was in Obergefell, which was the case. We said, listen, you, the government, how you choose to define marriage, that's a governmental decision. For us in our church, we will define it as this, and we will continue to do so. And that, I think, is a line that we drew appropriately back in 2015. But that's a fine line, and not everyone in the church, quite frankly, even agrees with that. There are people that think that, God created this institution, it should be reflected in the law. And there are certain beliefs that are in the Bible that we absolutely agree. Thou shalt not murder, perfectly fine for the state of Idaho to have a statute against murder. But you got to ask yourself, where is that line, and where do we have that? So yes.
Thank you. For those of us in the medical field, we're you talked about sex change procedures. We're starting to be pressured to partake in those procedures. I'm an anesthesiologist. As a provider, how would you navigate that? And also as a shareholder in a group that contracts with the hospital, how would you navigate that?
So it was kind of hard to hear. I think the question had to do with the providers. So generally speaking, these are brand new issues. So historically, where this had mostly come down was the issue of abortion. But because of things called the Church Amendment, named after a senator, not churches, and others, and the fact that just the realism of where abortions happen, people, if you were working for some place that provided abortions, that was your choice, right? Now we see reproductive rights expanding. We also see in the trans issues, the general line that I think we've sort of, or at least, and this is all subject to change, is first of all, there's a difference between emergency care and transitioning care. So I think anything that has to do with an emergency care that has to happen, I think, that's going to be very hard to say, well, my religious beliefs, are going to supersede your right to live. The Catholic Church, by the way, takes that position. It is their position that if you have, a Catholic hospital should not prefer the life of a mother over the life of a fetus. And if that means the mother dies, well, that's unfortunate, but that they're religious beliefs. And that's a very tough thing to sell to a judge and to a court. I think when it comes to elective issues and so forth, I think there's a lot more freedom there to say the person gets to have the treatment, they get to have what they want because that's their choice, but you need to find someone else that does this and is comfortable with it. And, we could spend the rest of the day here talking about all the nuances and details and regulations, but just at the maybe not 30,000 but 10,000 foot level, I think that's where we would have the line. On the side of a business and being a shareholder of a larger group, I think that's going to be something that person has to come to a personal opinion on, and are you willing to do that? What's happening? And also, even though transitioning, and we may not agree that a person should do that, is that something, especially when it's being done by adults, is that something that, is so morally reprehensible that you want to have nothing to do with it, even if you don't agree with it?
Todd, I have a follow-up question for you, which is, would you agree then, but that the way that society is moving, that we're going to see these challenges? Right now you're saying you're good rights-wise, right? As far as you should feel comfortable. But don't you think that this is the direction in which we're moving and that this is going to be experienced? Because again, talking about sort of the mood of the nation and the intolerance for any other perspective except for your own, right? Before, we used to have this plurality of viewpoints, and I may not agree with your view on gun rights or the environment or whatever, but to each his own, right? And we are no longer in that place anymore, right? So
no, we are in a Puritan time frame, right, where there's one truth, one belief, and if you deviate from that, then you must be cast out into utter darkness.
Mine is a bit of a multi-layered question. First, I wanted to clarify for the religious liberty part of it in the beginning. Are you guys advocating for being able to choose whether to hire or not hire people based on their religious beliefs?
So it depends on who the employer is. Sorry, this thing is right in the way. So for a non-religious employer, then absolutely not. Religion should not play a part, and you have to not only do that, you must accommodate. For a religious employer, whether it be Adventist, Catholic, Mormon, pick your favorite, religion, then no, they get to choose for their ecclesiastical organizations, their religious organizations, who they hire and who they don't. So it depends on who the employer is.
Okay. My kind of question with that is to pretty much since Seventh-day Adventists are considered a minority in the sense of most religions involve Sunday keeping, with that kind of ability to choose not to hire someone if they choose not to worship on Sunday, What's to keep that from snowballing into we can choose whether or not to sell or let you buy based on keeping Sunday?
So I think the difference is who the organization is, right? So if you're working for, a Catholic organization like the diocese or whatever, right? Or other explicitly religious organization, as part of their mission and as part of their belief system, by the way, the Catholics have very nuanced ideas on this. I'm just using this as an example. Then they have the right to hire people for their organization that align with their beliefs, right? Because that furthers their mission. And the reason is by drawing this line for a religious organization that is, and again, doing their religious activities, that's a small enough part of the economy that there's plenty of other jobs out there for people. Because, so for instance, the General Conference headquarters, we hire IT people, we hire building people. We believe all of those admins, we believe all of those positions and those people there have to be or need to be aligned with us in our beliefs to further the mission. However, and we've taken Muslim cases, we've taken Jewish cases. That doesn't mean if you're an IT person, there aren't other jobs. And, one of the cases the Adventist Church advocated on was a case called EEOC versus Abercrombie and Fitch. And that's where an Abercrombie and Fitch kids store didn't want to hire Samantha Eloff because she was wearing a hijab. And the Adventist Church advocated on that, played a very important role, I believe, in the Supreme Court taking that case, again, behind the scenes, and they ruled 9-0 for the EOC and Samantha Eloff. So that's where it is. I understand what you're saying, but I think there's a very clear line between a religious organization and a secular one that we can make.
All right, thank you. Right over here.
I think many in the church felt that the COVID thing was kind of a dress rehearsal for eschatologically speaking. The church is forced to close. There was some talk about passports so that you could show you had a vaccine so you could go to Walmart and buy something, that sort of thing. And there were a lot of folks, I think, in Idaho that were really surprised that the church folded so quickly here and shut down. And I'm just kind of curious as to what is the criteria that the church ought to have or does have with regards to following what the government says to do. And is that kind of a slippery slope that little by little we'll get to the place where it would come to the final decision, there's no decision to make. And then secondly, after COVID, major corporations and businesses were sitting around boardrooms and committees and talking about the impact of COVID and what it had on businesses. Some businesses decided cut way back on brick and mortar. Those kinds of impacts. They were making decisions, business decisions, based upon what had happened for the last 2 years. My second question is, what is the Adventist Church doing to reevaluate where we are, how we're behaving, how we're conducting church, how we're doing the business of the gospel to the world in the light of COVID? And what changes should we be looking at, and what would help us to survive something like this better in the future?
Well, let me start off with a few things on that. One of the issues that we were dealing with is the idea that it's not like the church had a whole lot of what I would call experience managing through pandemics. Obviously, we had something we were dealing with back in the early 1900s, but so much of what we were doing, in particular with COVID, was really learning on the fly. And now the slippery slope point that you have made, I think, is a very valid point, but there were a lot of the battles that we were working on in terms of ensuring that, whatever was happening, that from a religious perspective, we would be treated fairly. Give you a perfect example. I was fortunate enough to sit on the governor's task force in the state of Maryland regarding the opening and closing of houses of worship. One of the issues that we ended up and also ended up getting changed in the state was when you can come to a conclusion that liquor stores and gambling casinos can be open, but churches can be closed, that's a problem. And so one of the things that we had to do was to not necessarily say that we don't think anything should be open at a certain point or closed at a certain point, but the question was, how do we make sure we're all treated equally? So if you can have 25 in a liquor store, you should be able to have 25 in a church. If you can be open at this time as it relates to this particular area, then you have to explain to us why it can't be happening from this particular area. We ended up even having houses of worship and also the work of ministers being viewed as part of essential services when it was all said and done. But when the conversation verse gets started, and believe it or not, there's kind of like always this thought process that someone is coming for the church. The reality is most of the time they're not even thinking about the church. And the ideas of what's important to us, which is why our voices are so essential to be out there. I mean, I'm on this task force saying, why are you opening liquor stores and closing churches? And everybody's looking at me like, we ain't really think about that. We just thought about, churches were not as important. How come a pastor's work is not an essential service at a time where we're in the midst of a pandemic? No, we really didn't think about that. But now that we have, let's start making some modifications moving forward. So I think basically, the word I think we use more in our work is balance and nuance. And those are the two phrases that you really have to work on a regular basis, because on one hand, you're getting these reports as to what we should be doing from a health protections perspective. But on the other hand, you want to make sure that you are not just falling in line with something where government could be causing you to do something where you have to be standing up as it relates to your religious freedom. But then that has to be balanced from a safety perspective. And then even when you look at it, COVID was operating differently in many different states. There was some conferences and organizations that ended up opening back up quicker than other churches and conferences because of what the statistics were in terms of how COVID was impacting certain places. COVID in a wide open place like Idaho is very different than COVID in New York City, where they got into a point where they couldn't even find enough morgues to deal with the number of people who were dying there. And so when you're trying to manage through and make rulings that is covering across a multi-jurisdictional, multi-denominational, multi-geopolitical, everything, it becomes very difficult. And what we ended up doing in large part, I think, was we ended up getting more into allowing regions to view things a little bit differently based on the information that we were getting from the regions. So trying to find that balance was very, very difficult, but I think trying to make sure that we were ensuring that churches would not be treated, in a way that they would be what I would call discriminated against based on being a religious organization. So I think that's part of it. But the issue regarding watching out for the slippery slope, everybody talked about that. And everybody was looking at that, and everybody was trying to figure out how to balance that properly.
If I can, I know to some extent it seemed like, especially from the litigation perspective, that the GC NAD wasn't really doing anything. And I think we were monitoring this from the beginning. The other reality is, so for a church, local church does not have the authority to bring a lawsuit against the county and so forth. That would have to go through the conference. Actually, it would have to be voted at the division level. You know how many requests we got the entire COVID time from a conference to challenge a local health rule for a church? The answer is 0. We did not have a single conference call us up and say, hey, and as Orland said, there was a huge disparity. There were parts, I remember I went down to Tennessee to visit some friends in May of 2020, end of May, left Maryland. It was just, as I was driving south, it was just amazing how things changed. And you go down there, if you wanted to go to church, there were places that you could. And so I think that's also from an organizational perspective was that the places that wanted to open up early, generally speaking, in a macro from the church, were able to. And then there were other congregations and other conferences that stayed closed much longer than legally required to. And so I think that was also from an institutional perspective sort of what we were looking at. And then eventually the Supreme Court, of course, made its decision in New York. And then from a legal perspective, the church openings that issue went away. And that was, I think, in 21 they made that. So, but yeah, it's a tough call, and I think everyone was struggling how to figure that out and where the balance was.
And from a union director's perspective, in the Southern Union, of course, we're a heavily populated area in the Southeast. And I had many members call and complain that their churches were closed. But then I had many members and pastors who were calling and saying, we have made lemonade out of this lemon. And I had people calling me, they were happy. They felt like the Lord had blessed them. They were serving their community. They hadn't had church in the sanctuary in 3 months, but every single week they had people come into their church. And so how we deal with crisis is very often dependent upon the personality that individuals in our church have and the personality of your church, your local church. And I noticed that the places where I got the most complaints were where the members only wanted to go to church. They were upset that they couldn't go to church physically. And the places where I had the most joyous reports were the places where the members were worshiping a different way, but serving their community in a way that was far bigger than they had ever served their communities before. And so, again, when life gives you a lemon, make some lemonade, you know. And I had so many churches that were doing that, so many people coming back and saying, I hate this pandemic. I would never wish it on us again. We don't like being closed. But we're not going to let Satan divide us, and we're not going to let Satan stop the ministry that we have in our community. And there were lots of ways people were doing that.
Amen. All right, we got the last 2 questions. We're going to go over here and then over here.
Yeah, there was a famous church in California. I think the reason I remember the name, it was Maxwell, not an Adventist, but it was a Maxwell was the pastor. And they were determined to stay open during COVID. Did our Religious Liberty Department, did you join in helping them, or what was your stance on that one? That's part A. And then a follow-up to his question regarding our medical people. I got the sense from talking to our doctors and nurses in St. Al's and St. Luke's during COVID that they were not free, that they could not practice medicine the way they wanted to, that these big organizations had pretty well locked down what they could say and what they could do as far as treatment. In fact, one doctor who had retired during that time said one of the reasons he retired, got out of medicine, was he had no freedom. I mean, what has been your role in that for our medical people who are part of these mammoth organizations now who are controlled? They're bought and paid for, you know. That's where their check is coming from. They aren't independent like they used to.
So I think 2 things. First of all, the short answer to your question about that particular church is the Adventist church took no particular role in there. You know, we weren't asked to represent him. I don't know that we would have had he asked. And so, you know, we did not take a stance on that, which I wouldn't be apologetic for. There was a lot going on in that church. And, you know, there were, you know, like I said, the reality is people were dying. Coming back to the other question, people said it felt like it was a rehearsal for end times. If that's your case as far as public control, I think it was a complete failure. Just looking at it from a macroscopic perspective, almost every requirement in the United States, as opposed to other countries, ended up just breaking down. Churches were going back immediately. The show me your papers, masks. I mean, again, whether you agree with this or not, like, you know, the airlines wanted mask requirement put in by the FAA when, you know, during the 45 administration, right? Biden comes in, they put it in. Eventually, they had so much trouble with it, a single judge in Florida struck it down, and the White House and the FAA didn't even appeal it. They were so happy to go. The public health authorities, for better or worse in this country, have lost all credibility. And if we had another pandemic now, their ability to sort of put these social controls in and so forth, I think, at least in the United States, has been greatly compromised. And so I think from that perspective, it was, you know, as far as social control. Now, other places, like her home country, that would be Australia, it was a complete different experience, right? They literally put drones up, and if you were talking to your neighbor over the thing, $10,000 fine. Now, it's Australian dollars, so it's not that much. But I'm sorry. But anyway, so I'm sorry, that was...
That was uncalled for.
that was.
Oh, go ahead, sir.
Bettina, I'm sorry about that.
Thank you.
There seems to be so much more government involvement in our religious affairs these days, and I just wonder if we could hear a very clear definition of the separation of church and state. And is that definition perhaps evolved from its original intent?
Todd will start his legal meter.
No, you go on.
Go ahead, Bettina.
Original intent is an interesting proposition, and it really is the direction in which the Supreme Court is moving in terms of its interpretation of many constitutional questions. It's tricky for many reasons, not least because 250 years ago in 1791, when the First Amendment was drafted, you have to remember that the drafters of that amendment were a group of white landowning men who were operating within a very specific socio and political framework, and they were putting in place measures that were intended, frankly, not to benefit the majority of the then population of America, which was enslaved men and women, indigenous Americans, and women generally. So original intent, I think, is it's going to prove a very tricky road for the courts to follow. And I think we are already seeing that in the confusion in the lower courts surrounding constitutional law questions, where the lower courts are trying to implement this idea of original intent in place of the more familiar tiers of scrutiny which we've operated under for the past number of decades. So there's that issue. Separation of church and state, a very clear and concise definition. If I had that, I would be famous. But I would say it's simply this. Religion flourishes best when the government cannot put its thumb on the scale in terms of religious questions. The government flourishes best when religion cannot put its thumb on the scale regarding questions of state. Now, you can argue those lines and where they're drawn, and that's what the courts are for. That's what we do in the courts, and it's a constantly evolving process. But I think for us as Seventh-day Adventists, we have a certain prophetic outlook that determines, our macro view of these questions. And it's a prophetic outlook that says, at some point down the track, America will be not a friend to liberty in many ways. And we need to not buy in to the current ideas that are floating around that say that a more Christianized America is going to be a benefit to religion. I think ultimately we know through our prophetic understanding that that is a fallacy. That said, we have to recognize that establishment clause, separation of church and state is often used these days in a way that is hostile to religion. We're not oblivious to that. We understand that. And so, again, the path that we are trying to walk is a middle path. And it's a path that not many religious denominations are walking. But we have a unique message to give. We are uniquely placed to give this message. And I think we can bring that balance to the discussion of these issues, and that's what we're trying to do.
Orland, bring us home.
Thing to that. There are a number of areas that you find the government reaching their hands into that the reason that sometimes they had to is because the churches were handling things in a poor way. And sometimes there's a certain power, like, for example, even things like, like divorce. There was a time that I don't think the government would have ever wanted to be involved in some of these type of activities, but when the church kind of failed in how they were, quote unquote, doing their roles, and they looked like they were almost putting their thumb on, and there would be one group of individuals who seemed to benefit more than another group of individuals, then what ends up happening is sometimes the government finds itself having to come in and play referee in certain instances. The other thing is that as a church body, we have to be cautious in making sure that we're living our lives in a way where we don't look like we're using our religious power as a sword as opposed to using it as a shield. Right. The idea that we get to, quote unquote, have certain protections, and to some degree, what we are also given is the power to discriminate. And when we utilize that power, we have to use it in what I would call in a way in which we are being more like the lamb and the dove as opposed to being like a lamb or like a lion and a serpent. So part of how we continue to make sure that we can have what I would call positive reactions as it relates to what goes on from a church perspective, as it relates to separation of church and state, is ensuring that we as a church are operating in a way where we are being what I would call a very positive citizen in society and how we go about doing what we do. And when we get the opportunities to protect ourselves and our religious beliefs, that we don't use that same opportunity to use that as a club to beat other people. And I think as we go through the process and finding that right balance, I think it's important. The Establishment Clause piece, I think, is always going to be critical because that's how you really have the protection to make sure the Congress isn't, making any laws that basically is going to be putting pressure on a religion or therefore creating its own religion in some form or fashion. So to me, that part we have to protect because that protects more what I would call smaller religious groups more than anything else. But we also, in my opinion, have to remember that when you get these opportunities, because remember, when we get certain opportunities, the rest of society looks at those opportunities and said, we don't think they should have gotten that. So part of the question is how do you utilize it when you get it to make sure that you're obviously looking to protect individuals and not harm individuals with those powers.
I was doing a Q&A religious liberty panel, well, actually one-person panel, in the Washington conference, and the question came up very similar to yours, because I talked about all these kind of package of things that parole directors do, and he asked, just in one sentence, what is it that a religious liberty leader does? What do you do? And I thought about it, and I said, you know what? Here it is. I fight government overreach. That's what we do. Will you please thank our panel for their time today?
He said he fights government overreach.
I just want to close with this. We heard Wendy's children's story today that we're all citizens of heaven. We're all children of God. And from the divisive nature that we have in our discourse, in our culture, I want to leave you with Ephesians chapter 4. And these are the words of Paul. I urge you to live a life worthy of the calling that you've received. Be completely humble, gentle, patient, bearing with one another in love. Make every effort to keep the unity of the Spirit through the bond of peace. There is one body, one Spirit, just as you are called, one hope, and one Lord, one faith, one baptism, one God, and Father of all, who is over all, in all, and through all. May we walk in the manner worthy of the calling that we've received as children of God and Seventh-day Adventist Christians. Father in heaven, we thank you for being with us in our discussion. We ask that you bless the members and the leaders of this church and the mission that it carries out in the Treasure Valley. And we also ask your blessing and your continued guidance and wisdom on us as religious liberty leaders, that we'll continue to carry on the mission of your church throughout throughout North America and throughout the world. We thank you for the rest that we're receiving for this Sabbath day. Go with us now as we part ways, and that we will remember that all the blessings that we receive come from your hand. We thank you and pray in Jesus' name. Amen. We have had a blessed week at our meetings here in Boise. Cloverdale, thank you for your hospitality today.